Spider-Man 2 is a soulless game. Now relax, I'm not saying the game is terrible, but it's a very mixed bag with extreme highs and lows. First things first, the story. I hate to say it, but our boy Pete has become the Vegeta of his own story. So what's the Vegeta treatment? Well, the Vegeta treatment, or VT for short, is when a side character, usually a prominent one or a deuteragonist, fights the big bad before the main character and loses fairly badly. This is done to establish the villain amongst fans and is generally regarded as a weak way to do so. Back to Pete. He is constantly used as a measuring stick for the villain's power level. We know Pete is strong, so whenever he gets smoked by a villain, we're supposed to be even more impressed by them. But it's not impressive, it just kind of takes me out of the story. This is a Pete that's been Spider-Man for 10 plus years, and for him to constantly get one up by Miles, who's been Spider-Man for a year or so, is just so unrealistic and comes off as lazy. There were glimpses of the Vegeta treatment in the Miles Morales game, but I hope they wouldn't expand on it back then. Unfortunately, they fully leaned into it. And look, I love Miles as a character, and Into the Spider-Verse is in my personal top 5 movies of all time. But that doesn't mean I want to see Peter get shafted. Pete's meant to be the mentor and an equal, but the writers seem to really favour Miles. Now onto the actual story. Kraven has cancer and is hunting an adversary that is worthy of taking his life. He comes to New York due to his high density of supervillains and kills a few of Spidey's rogue gallery. We see many from previous games return, like Martin Lee and Tombstone, as well as some new faces like Lizard and Sandman. This is a fun setup, and Kraven is just a clean ass motherfucker. All he cares about is throwing hands, and I'm here for it. His story, while simple, is enjoyable, and especially when listening to those calls that he has with his family. And man, that death scene, I didn't expect a AAA Marvel property to have that kind of brutality considering kids play this. Kraven's entire arc was definitely one of the highlights of the story. Harry is a pretty straightforward character, a typical fall from grace with redemption at the end. That being said, I did enjoy the scenes with him and Pete. The weird vibes and the call of Miles was surprisingly realistic. Any of you who have tried to introduce two of your friends to each other have definitely experienced that initial awkwardness. The friendship dynamic between all these characters is fun to watch and comes off as genuine. Harry's Venom arc is pretty predictable, to be honest, and they rarely go off the path you're expecting. I won't be too harsh on the predictability of the story though, since we all know Venom is a villain. The mini Agent Venom arc was cool, and perhaps we're building to that in a future game. Dealing with Carnage and seeing Venom and Spidey team up would be interesting. Green Goblin is hinted at too, so we could have a real dark third game. The Peter boss battle is so fun. We basically get to see the villain's perspective when they fight Peter, and it was done right after you fight Kraven, so you really feel the contrast. There were little cool details like Peter throwing projectiles at Miles and catching them after Miles tries to throw them at the belt. Also, that Miles Bakugo moment was amazing. I don't know if they got the inspiration from My Hero Academia, but that's the first thing I thought of. It doesn't really help with the whole Vegeta treatment thing with Pete, since he literally lost with the symbiote, but it was a fun scene and I can turn my brain off for it. Moving on to Miles' story. Quick shout out to the Spider-Verse suits. They look so good, especially the Across the Spider-Verse one. In the past games, I didn't really like changing suits that much because they made the cutscenes feel a little goofy, but I think Miles' cutscenes probably look the best in the Spider-Verse suits. Credit where credit is due, and that little crossover tease with the girl in the portal and the Miguel name drop. I'm biased when it comes to Spider-Verse, but I don't care. That was one of the highlights of the game. Martin Lee is so fucking cool. His design is clean as fuck with the long hair, and something about the negative effect looks so much better in this game. I almost forgot how sympathetic of a villain he is. The dynamic between him and Miles is so interesting. Since Miles knows barely any of the context of Lee's story, he's just a villain who killed his dad to him. Lee, on the other hand, is reluctant to hurt Miles, and when he finds out why Miles hates him, he can't help but feel bad. As he said when they fought, it was never personal for Lee. All the pain he caused was just collateral damage. It was nice to see Miles shine without shitting on Peter as well. The Lee arc is his own story, and I think that's where he shines the most. Overall, I wasn't the biggest fan of the story and kind of felt like the Venom plot dragged down the whole game. I wish they focused on Kraven more, as he was the more interesting character. That being said, it was cool to play as Venom and gave me flashbacks to the Ultimate Spider-Man on the PS2. Norman Osborn is either brain dead or some of the writers are. How the fuck does Norman not know Pete is Spider-Man? MJ is constantly around Spider-Man. She's there right at the end when Norman is shouting at Spider-Man before hopping in the ambulance and literally holding hands with him. He also should have the security footage of her snooping around his crib in the first game. This version of Norman clearly isn't the sharpest tool in the shed. Which brings me to my second point about Norman. His reasoning for hating Spidey is stupid from a writer's perspective. He blames Spidey for taking the symbiote out of Harry and essentially rendering rendering him comatose. However, that's kinda stupid considering that was the only way to save him from being this monster as Venom. I get that Norman is unreasonable and refuses to believe that this was the only way to save Harry, but it's too weak of a reason to kick off the hate boner that Green Goblin has for Spider-Man. Why at no point does Norman question how Spider-Man got the symbiote? This should have been the reason for Norman hating Spider-Man in my opinion. The so-called hero stealing Harry's cure, Harry being unable to tell his dad the truth without outing Peter, leading to Norman's hatred spiraling throughout the game. Then finally that resentment reaching a boiling point because Spider-Man turned his beloved son into Venom with his meddling. I don't know man, for Spider-Man's most iconic villain to be set up this way, I'm kinda worried what they're gonna do with the Goblin. To be fair, I don't think the story in these Spider-Man games has been great outside of the first one. That one had heart and soul, and even when it was predictable, it was enjoyable because we cared. The Miles game had very uninteresting and boring characters throughout. Finn was boring, and Simon, I think his name was, is literally your token Elon Musk tech billionaire Scooby-Doo villain. Kraven is definitely a huge improvement on that, but unfortunately Venom brings it down because the overall game has a worse story because of it. One positive surprise was definitely the MJ missions. They aren't nearly as bad as the first game, and I understand why they have to include these. While they're not the most fun of missions, I think they add to the suspense of the situations. It's such a drastic change of pace, going from a powerful Spider-Man to a weak human. The idea is cool, but I hope they tweak the execution. The AI is still incredibly stupid, and the missions generally follow the same blueprint. It also kinda broke the immersion a bit since MJ is literally taking down a whole squad of Kraven's hunters at times. Makes you think, why don't the Spider-Man use that one-shot taser that she has? Maybe they just enjoy beating villains with their bare hands? Or does Spider-Man secretly say this? No, for real though. While the missions were fun, it's very jarring to see MJ take out squads of trained killers. Doesn't really make sense. One aspect of the game where they undeniably cook is the soundtrack. The music is great from top to bottom. Kraven's theme bangs. It reminded me of God of War with a little bit of Skyrim with the low growling bass. It matches the vibe of the character perfectly. I like all of the variations of the Spider-Man theme too. One of the Roaming the City tracks sounds very similar to the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. theme. For all three of you who've seen that show. I don't know if it was a reference or done on purpose, but both are Marvel properties, so who knows. Either way, it's a great song. Moving on to the main reason I called this game Soulless. The side missions in this game are repetitive garbage. I don't know how Insomniac gets away with shit that games like Assassin's Creed would get crucified for. This is one of the most egregious examples of filler I've ever seen in a AAA game. What makes it worse is that this is the third game in the franchise and the base gameplay has stayed relatively the same throughout. You would think that would give the developers time to innovate and focus on other aspects of the game like the side missions, but time and time again they haven't, and these games have some straight up terrible side content, bro. The music side missions in the Miles Morales game, you can't tell me those weren't straight cheeks. Absolutely terrible. After playing a game like God of War Ragnarok and seeing how they handled side quests, it's kinda hard to go back to this face value collector's wet dream. This is the third game in the franchise and it feels like DLC. That is not a good thing. Marco's memories were kinda cool. I was actually interested in learning what happened to him and his family. The problem is the actual missions are boring. Fighting those sand clones 15 times or however many times it was got repetitive fast. That's kinda the tail of the tape with a lot of these side missions. They're either terrible like the Brooklyn Visions and drone chasing missions. Please God Insomniac, don't add this type of mission to the next one. I'd rather collect 70 backpacks instead of this. Or they're kinda interesting but quickly become repetitive and wear out their welcome like Mysteriums and Marco's Memories. That's not to say they're all bad though, there are definitely some diamonds in the roughs here. The first of which being the flame missions. The twist with the cultists was crazy. They kept talking about the Crimson Hour and I never put two and two together. At one point I did realize that the villain had red hair, but it was a minute or two before the reveal, so I don't get any points on figuring that one out. Cletus was actually a fairly intimidating and unhinged villain and I'd like to see more of him. One thing that was weird is that there doesn't seem to be much of a connection between Carnage and Venom in this game universe. I'm not a comic reader really, but I'm pretty sure Carnage is the offspring of Venom, so this was a weird way to go about it. Now at most they'll probably just be from the same ship or planet or meteorite rather than a direct link like it usually is. I don't know, they might retcon that later, but it was just weird to see. Next up we have the Find Grandpa mission, which was exactly the type of thing I want in a Spider-Man game. A wholesome interaction with great writing. Man, it tugged on the heartstrings and even threw a little wisdom in there too. I played as Miles, so it really felt like a kid listening to an old head drop some knowledge on it. Great mission. Howard. A beautiful little mission, short, sweet, and quietly devastating. We learned that Howard was fired from the factory after working there for 20 years and that his wife passed away shortly after. But there was still hope for him as his pigeons gave him a new lease on life. We then hear that he wants us to take his birds someplace north that's peaceful because apparently he's going on an adventure. That ominous tone stays with you the whole mission. You whistle and you're off, gliding over the East River with the birds still following you as you take them up to the forest. Unfortunately, when we return, we don't see Howard on the bench. Instead, we see an ambulance along with 2 EMTs. Howard passes away, but he finally gets to be with his wife. It's implied that he committed suicide, and man, what a sad mission. It was a great reminder that the people in the city still have everyday problems that Spider-Man can't fix. After that, I definitely swung around the city for a while, stopping crimes in the memory of Howard. Unfortunately, those are the only good side missions in the game. I enjoyed the EMF experiments, but I wish they made them more complex and leaned into them more. The symbiote nests were also cool since it was finally a different style of side mission with the whole survival theme, but both of these quests were hindered by a major issue that brings the whole game down. Spider-Man 2 is very easy, even on Spectacular. Any difficulty other than Spectacular is nowhere near hard enough. I'm not even the type to play on the highest difficulty usually. I like to go for the second highest for most games, so the challenge is there but not absolutely ridiculous, but Spider-Man was just too easy, so I had to. The abilities are so powerful that it makes any other difficulty kinda pointless. It's a burdensome issue to tackle since you want the player to feel powerful as Spider-Man, but you also want the combat to feel rewarding. I think the difficulty level of the first game on PS4 was perfect. As the series of games continued, they've struggled to balance the new abilities. The gadgets are overpowered. At one point at the start of every fight, I could just use my gadgets and damage or even take out a majority of the enemies. I shouldn't be able to do that on the highest difficulty. I don't even think this is a specific Spider-Man problem. I believe that this formula is just starting to show its age. First being introduced with Batman Arkham Asylum, it's been 15 years of essentially the same style of gameplay. It's time to experiment. Sure, not all experimentation will be successful, but I would rather them try to expand on the formula instead of playing it safe. I think the movement mechanics should be kept the same though. They're damn near perfect. The web swinging is great, fluid, and the web wings just add to it. As someone who's played a few of the Just Cause games, I'm very glad they added the wingsuit mechanic because it always felt like Spider-Man to me. The combat needs to be revamped though. Maybe make enemies progressively more difficult as the game goes on, or maybe even have the enemies evolve. Having some that can nullify abilities like those dogs would definitely add to the difficulty. I don't think those dogs were there nearly enough. Perhaps add an enemy that can break out of webs. You see them struggling in webs, so maybe if you take too long to finish the encounter, enemies start escaping, making it that much more difficult to finish the encounter. You could also add enemies that make noise after you do a stealth takedown, so you're forced to move. I don't know man, I'm just throwing some ideas out. My point is that they don't need to throw the whole combat system away to innovate. It just felt very lazy, and I feel like they knew this game would be a hit after the first one and even Miles Morales, so they did the bare minimum. Now to wrap it up, after all that yapping, do I think Spider-Man 2 is a bad game? No. There is definitely some good here, and while I did complain about the lack of difficulty, if that's fixed in a patch or something, my rating of the game would definitely go up. I almost forgot to mention the performance issues. I don't know what's going on with this game. Generally speaking, as long as a game runs well, I usually don't give a fuck. I'm not ACG or game ranks, these are just my opinions, but man, the performance of this game wasn't great. It crashed on me twice, and I had multiple occasions where I would get stuck in a wall or clip through an enemy and have to restart the last checkpoint. Especially in the Mysteriums, there were so many times where I would try to web over to those enemies on the trains or just be fighting enemies and clip through something and have to restart the whole thing. There would also be times where I would start a cutscene and the screen would be black for the first few seconds of the scene with only the audio coming through. So yeah, as it stands, I'd give it a 6.5 out of 10 with the potential to go up to a 7.5 if some of the issues are fixed, like the performance problems and the lack of difficulty. Thanks for watching. Do you agree with any of the points I made? Do you think Spider-Man 2 is the best game ever and maybe I'm just misunderstanding its greatness? Either way, let me know in the comments. I replied to pretty much all of them. If you need some new shows to take up your time now that you're done with Spider-Man, watch this right here.